Hi, Debbie.
Hello. We're having a little Skype issue today. I don't know what it is. How's my audio?
Audio is good.
Okay. So today we're going to interview Graham Phillips. Graham has authored over a dozen books, including his most recent titled The Lost Tomb of King Arthur. He began his career as a radio journalist with BBC, also a magazine editor, but since then he's become one of Britain's most well-known nonfiction writers. His research into historical archives has resulted in some very controversial claims about legendary figures such as Moses, and has even sparked the interest of the Vatican and the Pope. So this research has been widely used for popular major motion pictures such as Raiders of the Lost Ark and historical documentaries, and he's done numerous TV appearances on shows like the History Channel. I think I just saw him on Forbidden History. We're very excited to have Graham Phillips from Britain here on Lost Knowledge today. Welcome to the show, Graham.
Thank you very much for having me on, Debbie. Can you hear me okay?
You're perfect.
Cool.
So my co-host is Michael Hathaway.
Hello, Michael.
Hi, Graham. Really looking forward to the show.
Oh, thank you very much.
So, Graham, let's start out. We have a lot of things to talk about. Let's start out by asking, just briefly, how did you get started into the type of research that you do on these legendary popular figures?
I don't know.
Right? I mean, I read about
stopped.
you and they call you a historical detective, you know, but why? We want to know why.
Well, basically, I trained as a journalist, and the magazine you mentioned that I worked for was all about unsolved mysteries. And the ones I got most interested in, this is back in my 20s, like 30 years ago or something, what I got most interested in is the mysteries of history that have never been solved. The paranormal is one thing, and I'm fascinated by it, that you can never really pin it down and discover anything that people can say, yeah, that is definitely something. We can actually go and look that up, or here you found something. But with the historical mysteries, you either found something or you didn't. You could actually trace somebody's grave where it was, or you didn't, or you could find some lost artifact, or you didn't. It was fairly straightforward. So I got fascinated by that. So that's kind of how it started about 30 years ago.
Wow, yeah. So, and your claims are somewhat controversial. I've read a few of them, and we'll get into them. But what's the public opinion been about your work so far? Do people find some of what you report on hard to believe?
Basically, the people who seem to get most annoyed about it aren't the historians or the archaeologists. It's people who have already had their pet opinions or theories, which I tend to have questioned. So it's a mixed sort of reception. They either like me or they hate me.
Well, I love it. I love it. We want to know all about it. We want to know the lost knowledge, the hidden truths. So the current book, The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, you say you found his King Arthur's tomb recorded from a monk in the 9th century, and you found a lot about this guy Merlin. Can you tell us, did you actually find King Arthur's tomb and who this Merlin is?
Well, it's a fairly long story, but to put it very succinctly, the monk that you mentioned in the 830 wrote about a character called Arthur, who united the Britons, the people of Britain, against an invasion from Germany by the Anglo-Saxons around the year 500. But he doesn't record him in the way that the later stories have Arthur fighting dragons, rescuing damsels in distress and so forth. He simply records him as an historical figure in a book he wrote about the history of Britain. And he says that he fought a series of successful battles. He united the Britons in their fight against this common enemy, and he was very successful. So based on his word, it seems that there really was an historical person behind the later legends of King Arthur. And what I did in my research was to try and find out where this Arthur, this historical figure, had come from. And obviously somebody might say, well, you could just go and look for somewhere called Camelot. That's where he's supposed to have ruled. But the name Camelot was an invention made up by a poet in the 1100s. Earlier references than that do refer to Arthur ruling from a magnificent city, the capital of Britain, around 500 AD. That's 1500 years ago. And So if I was going to look for an historical Arthur, I mean, they don't say the name of this place. It seems that it had been forgotten over the centuries. But if I was going to find this place, I had to find what was the capital city of Britain around 500. It wasn't London, as it had been during the Roman period. The Romans left Britain in the 400s and was later. Again, London was the capital. But for a while the Anglo-Saxons were invading Britain, they'd invaded the east of Britain, where London is, leaving another Roman city, an old Roman city called Viraconium, which is in the centre of Britain, as the new capital at the time Arthur is said to have lived. And the ruins of this city are still there to be seen in open countryside near a town called Shrewsbury in the centre of England. And it's protected by the English heritage who run the site. But you can see all the walls and you can see all the foundations of this once brick-built city. And there's a museum on the site, small museum, where finds that archaeologists have made over the years are on display. And the archaeologists discovered, and this is incredible, that around the year 500, when Arthur is said to have lived, this city was not only massively refortified, but and rebuilt, but right at the centre of it, there was this new palatial mansion that was built that seems, according to archaeologists, to have been the seat of an important Dark Age warlord. In fact, it seems from the archaeological point of view that whoever ruled from there was the person who united the Britons at the time Arthur is said to have done that. So I believe that this ruined city of Viraconium was the historical Camelot where the Arthur mentioned by this monk actually came from.
And what about Merlin? Can you tell us a little bit about him? Because he's kind of got like this little bit of a fascinating aura about him.
Well, this monk also mentions a person who ruled. The monk's name was Nennius. He was one of the only people writing during the Dark Ages. People wonder why, when the Romans left Britain in the 400s, you've got a period of about 500 years where hardly any records have survived. The main reason being that law and order broke down, the country fragmented into separate kingdoms. And the problem was there was, A, people were not being educated to write, and B, there was nothing to write on. The manufacture of paper was an industry, if you like, during Roman times. There was nobody making paper apart from a few monasteries. So this is why monks were the ones who were recording what was going on. And this monk Nennius, a couple of hundred years after the time Arthur is said to have lived, he says that before Arthur, there was another warrior who began to unite the Britons, who was one of the last of the Roman generals in Britain, and his name was Ambrosius Aurelius. Now, all the later stories of King Arthur, when they refer to Merlin, tell us that Merlin wasn't his real name, it was a title. It actually means the eagle. In fact, there's still a bird today called a Merlin, a bird of prey. And Merlin it tells us that his real name was Ambrosius. So I believe that the historical Merlin was this same character that's referred to by the monk Nennius as Ambrosius Aurelius, who was the last of the Romans who had a legion with him in Britain after the rest of the empire had collapsed. He started to unite the Britons, but it seems that he was injured or he got too old to lead the battle himself. And it was later that Arthur took over, and this man, Ambrosius, as I say, is recorded historically at the time in some of the few records that have survived, then takes over as a advisor to Arthur.
Awesome. Yeah, so you're finding all these connections, and the records of everything is right there for us. We just have to have someone like you that can do the meticulous research, right?
Absolutely. Arthur and Merlin were real figures.
Right. So, okay, I'm going to move around a little bit because you've written so many books about so many.
Can I ask one question?
Okay. Yeah. Michael has a question.
Yeah. Graham, when you write, research, or visit these sites, do they become alive to you in your mind? And if they do, how much of that gives you insights into finding clues that could be absolutely historically proved?
Well, I'll give an example of that. when I visited this place called Viraconium, I was able to look into some of the records about it, and there was a poem that was written, a war poem about battles and things that were fought in the Dark Ages, about this city of Viraconium, and it tells us that the person who ruled from that city at the time that Arthur lived was a man called Owen, but he had a battle name. Remember I said that Merlin was actually called, meant the eagle. A lot of British warlords at this time and leaders had names of animals as honorary names, like they were given to represent their prowess in battle, like, for example, the fox, if you were cunning, or and the hound, and many other names. The man whose name was Owen, who ruled from this city of Viraconium, his battle name was in Latin Ursus, which translates into the bear. And in Brythonic, the language spoken in Britain at that time, the word for a bear is Arth. And I believe that that could very easily have turned into the name Arthur. So you've got the man who rules from the most powerful city in the country. At the time Arthur is said to rule from the most powerful city in the country, was actually called Arth. I think there's no doubt that I found him. And you asked about if I actually get some kind of like tie-up with this. Well, when I found out that perhaps I should be looking for this man called the Bear, the very day or the night before I first found out this information about, written down historically that he was called the Bear, I had a dream that I was being chased by a bear. So I don't know. Is that the place calling out to me in a dream?
Maybe. So let's talk about Moses for a minute. You wrote a book, Moses Legacy, and I guess you found Moses's staff, right? His staff, and can you talk a little bit about that, because that's very significant, finding information that leads us, into some background about him. He's a very legendary religious figure.
Yeah, the research that I did into him suggested that basically reading the Old Testament, what it seems to be telling us is that Moses was buried at a city in an old settlement in an area in the south of Jordan, where there was a later city built called Petra. Now, Petra was built, as it's the ruins of it now, in the Roman period, but much earlier on, sort of 3,000 years ago, when Moses was said to have lived. It seems that the settlement that was at this place called Petra is where he was buried. And in fact, there are some earlier references to Moses that are not in the Bible, but written by Jewish historians back a couple of thousand years ago, that talk about Merlin being buried next to a snake monument, and that there are remains that I managed to discover, along with other archaeologists, of a monument in the shape of a snake that is in this valley of Petra in southern Jordan. And we discovered that in the middle 1800s, a couple of British archaeologists went there and discovered a tomb exactly underneath where this snake monument was. It had seemed to have been robbed at some point in the past because there was no body in it. There was a few bits and pieces of pottery, but in there was a staff, just a wooden staff that had managed to survive because it's very dry there, so it hadn't rotted away. And it had just been left at the corner because obviously whoever had robbed the grave at some point over history hadn't considered that worth having. And it was painted black with white hieroglyphics on it. And that was taken eventually to a museum in Birmingham in central England, which Birmingham is the second biggest city in England. And it's still on display in the Birmingham Museum now. And I had experts examine it, and the hieroglyphics actually say that the staff belonged to a man called Tutmosis. And I believe that this Tutmosis, who was a prince in Egypt, or a very high-ranking figure, was the person upon whom the story of Moses was eventually based, because Moses is said to have been brought up as a prince in the household of the Pharaoh before he was cast out of Egypt. And he was also, the name Tutmosis means in Egyptian son of the god Tut or Thoth.
Mm-hmm.
If he'd have dropped that Thoth bit from his name because he became a Hebrew, then if you just get the word son left, you've got the name Moses. So I believe that this staff that's in Birmingham Museum actually was the one that belonged to Moses. And I believe that, if the Bible's correct, it is the staff that he's said to have brought down the plagues of Egypt with, that he used to part the Red Sea. Whether that actually happened or not, who knows? But this is the staff that's accredited with this, and it's there for all the world to see.
Right. So, so you mentioned in another book, you talk about a comet that came around through the Earth, and you thought there was some correlation between some of the destruction that you just mentioned, the plague and the parting of the sea, that had to do with the polar ice caps and so on. Can you describe that a little bit? Because that's very interesting that these worldwide events were occurring as a cosmology, and then were recorded as something maybe that God did.
Yeah, there's two incidents. There's one which is this comet that appeared about 1500 BC, which was so bright in the sky it was probably the largest or the closest comet that's actually come to Earth since civilization began without actually hitting the Earth. It seems to have been considered as a sign from God, which started a one God religion in Egypt, which was probably the religion that became the religion of the ancient Hebrews, because they believed that this God was more important than any others. And so a one God religion, which the ancient Hebrews founded, the slaves in Egypt. The actual parting of the Red Sea and the plagues of Egypt, like that allowed the Israelites to escape from Egypt and Moses to lead them out, according to the Bible, there was a plague of darkness. Fiery hailstones fell from the sky. The river turned to blood and so forth. Well, at exactly the time this was supposed to have happened, which was around about mid-1300s BC, there was a massive volcanic eruption in the center of the Mediterranean at an island now called Santorini, the volcano of Thera. And it erupted, and the volcanic ash that was spewed out from it blew in the direction of Egypt. We know this because underwater archaeologists have found the pumice and the remains of the volcanic ash on the seabed across the Mediterranean from the direction of Santorini towards Egypt, and could have turned the sky from day to night, as the Bible says. Because of the volcanic ash. It would have also perhaps explained the fiery hailstones falling from the sky. The Thera volcano is incidentally, that from archaeological research now, has been shown to have been made primarily of iron oxide. It's a red staining stuff, like that dust on the surface of the moon. That could have caused the Nile to turn red, the Nile turning to blood, and so on. So I believe that was then caused by a volcanic eruption. The same volcanic eruption would have created tsunamis, which may have accounted for the parting of the Red Sea, or at least the seas going lower as before the tsunami sort of came inland, and then when the tsunami came, it could have washed away whoever was following the lucky Israelites who managed to cross over when the tides were lower. So what I'm saying, it's a bit more complicated than that, but in simple terms, I'm saying that a comet could have started the one God religion of the ancient Israelites, and then a volcanic eruption could have saved them from slavery in Egypt. And later, when the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, that, it seems, is from archaeologists who have excavated the walls of ancient Jericho, have found that a earthquake probably brought the walls of Jericho down just as the Israelites were trying to sieging the city. So it's really quite strange that you've got this comet and a volcano and an earthquake that all seem to benefit the ancient Israelites. No wonder they their religion has lasted so long.
Yeah, right. I want to ask one more thing about an older book that you did called The End of Eden. And it talks a little bit about the celestial, maybe experiences that could lead us down to some of the places where we're at. And one of the things that this book indicates is that this comet tail could have provided some kind of contamination in our atmosphere, some kind of chemical that causes aggressive behavior, and that worldwide hostility has abrupted since then, not abating. Can you talk about that? Because that sounds like it could have some truth to it.
Yeah, there's the comet, which some people interpreted maybe as a new god and started, monotheistic religion. What's interesting is at about the same time, 1500 BC, throughout the world, civilizations that had been living in peace suddenly became very aggressive. It happened in India, it happened in China, it happened in Central America with the Olmecs. And I was thinking it's a bit too coincidental that this one god religion starts off at the same time as in many places people become more aggressive, and it's all happening at the same time as this comet appears. And I sought the help of some astrophysicists to ask them, could a comet, if we went through the tail of a comet, if it came so close to Earth, is there anything that could be contaminating the atmosphere in the tail of a comet that could make people aggressive? And there is a substance that is known to appear in comets, certain comets. I think I'm pronouncing it right, vasopressin, I think it's pronounced. I might have got it wrong, but it's something like that. Basically, it is a substance, a compound that in the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, it is said that the certain divisions of the American military experimented using vasopressin, however you say it, on with soldiers to see if it made them more determined in battle. Now, whether that's true or not, who knows? But the truth is that this substance does create aggressive behavior if you swallow it or breathe it in, or if it contaminates the food chain.
Oh,
and I believe that this is what happened in 1500 BC. I can't prove it, but it's very possible. Mm. It's interesting that this particular comet that came very close to Earth is actually coming back in 2024, if I remember right. Mm-hmm. So we'll see what happens then.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Earth always moves, so we're continuing to move through, through part of our travels.
Well, the thing is, the comet might not come anywhere near us this time. Chances are it won't, so we probably won't know. But certainly the comet is coming back. And what I find interesting is because it will come close to the sun and it will be visible from Earth almost certainly. I think that they will probably send probes close to it to see what the tail is made of. They tend to do that when comets come round these days. NASA or the Russians or somebody will send some kind of probe, the European Space Agency, send some probe close to it, and they'll be able to tell if this, whatever's in the tail, does it include vasopressin? Vasopressin, or however you say it. Will it include that? I don't know. If it does, that puts a strong case for my theory. If it doesn't, then my theory out the window.
I want to ask you another question, and this gets into ancient history, kind of maybe a little bit also about what Michael mentioned earlier. You talk a little bit about Egypt and then about Atlantis, the civilization before Egypt. What are your thoughts on those very ancient civilizations, and have you done any research into something like Atlantis?
When my book about Atlantis first came out, it was entitled Act of God. And it was simply about ancient Egypt, the mystery of Tutankhamun, who was buried in this tomb opposite Tutankhamun's. It was all about the plagues of Egypt and was it caused by a volcano. The Atlantis bit comes in. When it was published in America, they decided to add the Atlantis thing into the title, Atlantis and the 10 Plagues of Egypt. Atlantis, it's not really an investigation into Atlantis, but what I am saying in the book is that the same volcano that caused all the trouble in Egypt and led to the story of the plagues also possibly was responsible for the legend of Atlantis, because when this volcano went off, it created a tidal wave that is known by archaeology to have created all sorts of mayhem at the nearby island of Crete. And that was the center of the Minoan civilization, who 3,500 years ago were possibly the most advanced civilization on Earth. They were way before the Greeks. But the tsunami that hit the coast of Crete, which is where the Minoan civilization was based, caused such devastation to the harbors and the harbor towns that the civilization there never recovered. And I am saying that this could have been the story behind the legend of Atlantis, or at least one of the stories behind the legend of Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
How did these ancient civilizations become so advanced, Graham? What's your take on that?
I don't know. The interesting thing is about the Minoans on Crete. I mean, everyone's heard of the ancient Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Romans. Very few people really, ordinary lay people know too much about the Minoans. But what's fascinating about them is that while nobody else in the world, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, or anybody at that time had done what they had done, they were the first people to have piped water. They had fresh water supply to each of the houses of the rich people that lived at their main city of Knossos. They was way before the Greeks or the Romans did the same sort of thing. They had houses that were built to a number of stories. I mean, people lived in apartment blocks, believe it or not, of sort of 6 stories high. The next people that did that were the Romans, many hundreds of years later. Where they got this knowledge from, who knows? It's this information. Some people believe that they got their civilization from some earlier civilization that lived beyond the Mediterranean, out in the Atlantic somewhere. And this is where another aspect of the Atlantis legend comes about. But I've not actually done research into that myself. But from what I can gather, some people believe that the Atlantis that lay over the Atlantic could be somewhere in the Caribbean, somewhere near Cuba, perhaps. Because there's been a number of underwater structures that have been found in the Caribbean that seem to be Greek-style ancient buildings. But I haven't done research into that myself.
Do you feel that there is off-world influence from other places in the universe on Earth?
My own personal belief in aliens is that people would say, well, if there are alien civilizations out there, how come we don't see them all the time? And people would say, well, we see these UFOs, and then the scientists will turn around and say, well, although UFO sightings are rubbish, I mean, no one's ever sort of taken a bit of a UFO in for scientific analysis, and no one's ever sort of seen a UFO land on the White House lawn or something. But in my opinion, any civilization that's out there, the chances are they're many, many thousands, if not millions of years in advance of us. If they're less advanced than us, they're not going to have come here. If they're more advanced than us, the chance of them being just a little bit more advanced, like a couple of 100 years, like you get in like Independence Day or something. I mean, these guys aren't that much more advanced than us. We can even bring them down with, traditional weapons if we can get their shields down. They might be millions of years in advance of us. The universe has been around for 13.5 billion years or something. And many other civilizations could have arisen before us. So we wouldn't even recognize the kind of technology they've got. As Arthur C. Clarke once said, a sufficiently advanced civilization would be indistinguishable from magic. So some of these weird UFOs and the way that people see them in different ways, and the way that people have strange experiences. Some people will see an angel, some people will see a Virgin Mary, some people will see a strange imp-like creature, somebody else will see a UFO. seems to be the acceptance level, or people themselves' mind is interpreting what they really can't comprehend. So I think a lot of these UFO and other strange and mysterious sightings could very well be some sort of alien civilization interacting with us in some way. But because we don't get a piece of metal ship and take it to a laboratory, or they don't land on the White House lawn, is because these beings are so far in advance of us. They don't use metal bits and land on lawns. So I think that there is the possibility that we are being visited and perhaps manipulated in some way, or helped, or whatever, all the time by some kind of alien civilization. But we're totally unaware of it on a general day-to-day basis because they're so far in advance of us. And those people could well be guiding us along some sort of line towards, development of civilization. That's my humble opinion.
That's quite an opinion.
I suppose it is.
We're in that same camp, though, so that's okay. We're not sure what it is, but we think along those same lines. We've talked a lot about also. I guess I could ask what you think about some of the work that Zachariah Sitchin and Eric von Däniken have produced, and even Michael Tellinger with some of the actual historical evidence of these civilizations building what could be possibly spaceports, what could possibly be remnants of dwellings where larger beings than us lived in some part of our past that we don't have recorded correctly. I mean, I guess that's not out of the realm of possibility, would you say?
Well, when I read Eric von Däniken's book, I was only about 16 or 15 or something. I remember being absolutely thrilled by the whole thing. Over the years, people have, discredited certain aspects of it. I think the problem is that there are many mysteries about why ancient people suddenly were able to do what they did, like the way that they were able to. I mean, ancient Egyptian civilization starts with the building, or pretty much starts with the building of the Great Pyramids, and later on they stop building them. I mean, usually the Great Pyramids are one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. The Pyramid of Cheops, or Khufu, was the largest building in the world until St. Paul's Cathedral was built in the late 1600s. I mean, it's astonishing that the early Egyptian civilization started off building these things, and no one quite knows how they did it. And then later on didn't bother. I mean, you'd imagine that they would gradually start to get to the point where they build something like this. Now, I don't believe that the pyramid actually forms any kind of landing thing, or there was of any use to the aliens themselves, because if there are aliens involved, that is, because why would they need some stone thing like that? But the fact that people were inspired to build it is the mystery, in my opinion. So somebody might say, well, there's no evidence, we'd never found a bit of a UFO or a bit of a crane that a UFO brought to Earth in order to build these things, so therefore there's no evidence that they were created by aliens. Well, the fact is, what I find interesting is the thought processes that suddenly made people do this. Why are they suddenly trying to almost build a Tower of Babel to get to heaven, so to speak? Why are they suddenly fascinated by the skies? Is this their response en masse to the fact that they've been openly visited by some kind of beings they don't understand? In other words, the beings that visit us today, most people who claim to see them are written off as lunatics or liars or whatever, mistakes. But back then, when people see these strange things, they're going to say, wow, this is the gods coming and so forth. So somebody then gets inspired about how to do a building technique, which we pretty much would be hard-pressed to do today without modern machinery. And that there's a mystery there. Where did they get, what inspired them to build it? I'm convinced that humans built it, but what inspired them? Is it like the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, where those apes suddenly find a monolith and it goes, and their brains suddenly grow a bit? I think there's evidence of that sort of thing in Earth history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, who knows? It'd be fun to find out more about that. I'm going to jump into something else real quick because I have it in my notes and I want to cover it with you. You published a book called The Virgin Mary Conspiracy, and I'm just a big fan of anything that's written about Mary Magdalene and the Virgin Mary. Your book indicates some really astounding information. Maybe you can get into it, that Jesus was the son of Herod, actually Antipater, who is the son of Herod, and
Jesus was his grandson.
Yeah, I mean, that's really astounding. What makes you believe that, and what has been the response to that when you published that information?
No response whatsoever. Well, actually, there was. I got excommunicated. I suppose that's quite a response.
Oh, no.
What happened is that, the evidence for that is, I was thinking, well, if Jesus was an historical figure, and if Herod, when he was born, according to the Bible, Herod orders the death of these baby boys that have all been born in and around Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and if known from the biblical account as the massacre of the innocents. Well, if this happened, there's got to be some record of it, and there is a record of Herod ordering the death of babies all around Jerusalem and that area at the time that Jesus was said to have been born. But that's written in the work of a first century Jewish historian called Josephus, and he tells us that Herod did this, but he's not looking to kill the baby Jesus as the Bible tells us is what Herod was doing. He's looking to kill a baby who is the son of his son, in other words, his own grandson. He had a son called Antipater, who was his heir, his oldest son, but he fell out with him, and then afterwards he decided to split the kingdom up between his other sons. Antipater, because he annoyed him, he ordered his death. Antipater was killed, so therefore the heir to his throne had gone. Now, people would say, well, he can make an heir who he wants, can't he? Well, he can't, because he was ultimately responsible to the Romans, and Antipater had been a friend of the Roman Emperor Augustus. And Augustus had said that Antipater or his successors, if they live, should be the successors to Herod when he died. Now, Herod was dying, so he had to make sure that his own son, plus any son that he had, was killed off, so his will would come to pass and his other sons would take over. Otherwise, the Romans would block it. Well, when Antipater was dead, he found that Antipater's mother, Antipater's wife, called Mariamne, had a baby, and that she was trying to flee with this baby. And it was that, according to Josephus, that baby, we don't know what he was called, that Herod sent his soldiers to try and find. And just to make things absolutely certain, he decided to order his soldiers to kill any baby they found. So if the Jesus story is based on anyone historically that we actually got historical records of, then it may be that Jesus was perhaps the story at least got confused between Jesus and this son of Antipater. Now, the interesting thing is that I began to think, could this son of Antipater actually have been the historical Jesus? Well, his mother was called Mariamne, and Mariamne was the Greek, because the early stories of Josephus wrote parts of his books in Greek for the Greek world. Mariamne is the Greek name for Mary. So this little kid's mother was actually called Mary. He was born at the same time as Jesus, and Herod tried to have him killed at the same time as Jesus was being. So unless Herod was going around killing babies every time some kid was born, I believe that whoever this baby was in fact the historical Jesus, and therefore it could have been Herod's grandson. Now, saying something like this, obviously, I mean, I might be wrong, but when the book came out, the Vatican found out about it. It did very well in Italy. The Vatican found out about it, and I suddenly got a phone call one day from a journalist in Rome who said, "What do you think about your excommunication, Mr. Phillips?" I said, "What do you mean excommunication?" He said, "Well, every week the Vatican publishes lists of the names of books which are banned and they can't be read in in Catholic schools and so forth, and your book, The Virgin Mary Conspiracy, is on it. I said, really? They said, yeah, which means you've automatically been excommunicated. I said, I'm not even communicated. I'm not a Catholic. So there you go.
Yeah, so the popes did a lot of sort of rewriting of history based on who was the pope or the ruler at that time. And I think getting into that and just, trying to uncover some of that and unravel it is very important. What did you find out about the Virgin Mary? You found her tomb? Is that was also in that book?
Yeah, what the Virgin Mary conspiracy, the conspiracy back in those days, because that book came out in before 2000, and back in those days you could use the word conspiracy in the title. You could use the word conspiracy. Now it's become like a dirty word. Oh, you conspiracy theorist. I mean, what is somebody trying to tell us there are no such things as conspiracies? Well, there certainly was in the Catholic Church in the early 50s, 1950s, because until that point, and there was a cover-up involved, and that, if that's not a conspiracy, I don't know what is. What had happened was that the Catholic Church owned, if you like, a tomb in Jerusalem where people would be shown this is where the Virgin Mary was buried. Now, we're not told in the Bible what happened to the Virgin Mary after, that's Jesus' mother, what happened to her after the crucifixion. We're not told at all. That's it. We're not told anything more about her. But the early Christian legend grew up that she was buried in a tomb in Jerusalem. A second Christian legend grew up that she was buried in a tomb in the city of Ephesus, which is in what's now Turkey. Both of these places had tombs that were open to the public, and and especially the one in Jerusalem, that were paid good money. People paid good money to go in these tombs and pray at the place where the Virgin Mary was said to have been buried. Now, early in Christian history, the legend or story came about that the Virgin Mary ascended to heaven bodily like her son Jesus. Therefore, there could be no bones of the Virgin Mary on earth. Now, some Catholics believe that, some Catholics didn't believe that. And it was pretty much up to the decision of the individual churchgoer to decide whether they believe that or not. But in, I think it was actually 1950, the Pope at the time made a declaration saying it is now official church policy, if you like, that we believe that the Virgin Mary did ascend bodily to heaven. So in other words, it now became, it was now essential for Catholics throughout the world to believe that she ascended to heaven, whatever they thought before, which was okay, fine. Most people probably didn't care one way or the other, whether she ascended to heaven or whether she was buried somewhere. But what about the church that was making a lot of money out of this tomb in Jerusalem in the Valley of Jehoshaphat? And so they basically, the people who were running this tomb went along to the Vatican and said, well, what are we supposed to do about this tomb? We've been telling people for years that the Virgin Mary was buried here, and we're taking money off people. And so the orders came down that the place should be sold off or given away to the Armenian and Greek Orthodox churches for them to run it, and basically to don't talk about it ever again. And that was the Virgin Mary conspiracy, to the whole cover-up of this thing. And what happened, an organization within the Vatican, which is known as it's basically what used to be the Holy Inquisition. It's now called something different, doctrine of something to do with the doctrine of the faith. I can't remember off the top of my head. But basically, they just got a guy from the Vatican who worked for the Vatican Museum to see how many other Virgin Mary tombs there might be kicking around and get them closed down. Now, there was this one I said that was at Ephesus, which is in Turkey. So when he went back to the Vatican, reported back, he said, yeah, okay, we know there's that one, and we know there's the one in Jerusalem. They've been cut, but there's a third one. There are people in the Isle of Britain who claim it's there. And that was totally covered up. And I had to try and find out, to my own satisfaction, where this place was. And it turned out being on a little island off the coast of Britain. And that was so covered up that the actual church where right next to where this was supposed to, she's supposed to be buried, is all boarded up and fallen down. It hasn't been, no one's been in it since the 1950s. The whole thing was closed up.
So, Graham, what are you finding? That there's just a lot of erroneous compiling of this religious text, and that, it's really up to us to kind of figure out and sort out what maybe our past is really like, and what it all means to us, and what religion, what role religion should or maybe should not play in our lives?
Well, I love going around investigating these mysteries, searching for lost artifacts and searching for ancient tombs. But while I do this, I'll find a lot of evidence that points out that quite a lot of what we consider to be history is either make-believe that is then being portrayed as history, myth and legend being portrayed in history, or that there are myths and legends which do have real history behind them. And there's so much more out. You see, you've got archaeologists who just dig in the ground. You've got historians who read ancient manuscripts. You've got people who investigate mythology and anthropologists. But these people never talk to each other. They don't look at all the different bits of information they have overall. So what I've tried to do is take a kind of holistic approach to bring together the pieces of these jigsaws. And I realized that when I put together what historians have found out, what archaeologists have found out, what folklorists have found out, and so forth, I can build a picture and recreate history in a more kind of enlightened light, if that's English. And in doing that, what I do in my books is say, look, this is what I've found. This is the evidence. Here's where I found it. If other people want to draw conclusions as to that, if that makes that religion or belief system or whatever stronger or weaker, you make up your own ideas, make up your own minds on that. And that's what I try and do.
Let me ask this. How about the Knights Templars?
The Knights Templars, what's fascinating about them, the research I did a book called The Templars and the Ark of the Covenant. They claim to have found a lot of artifacts in and around the Holy Land, which many people said that they had the Holy Grail. Some other people said they had the Ring of Solomon, the Sword of David, and all these other artifacts. One of the items that they claimed to have found was the Ark of the Covenant, and the particular Knights Templar group that found it came from England, and they claimed to have found the Ark of the Covenant at also this place Petra, which is the same place as this rod, the staff of Moses, was found. And incidentally, Petra's been in the news in the last couple of days because they have found a temple there, buried temple, which has been completely unknown until now, which seems to date from the very earliest period of Petra, perhaps going back to the time of Moses himself. And it's a kind of world news scoop about archaeology that this temple being found there. And it's found right next to where the Templars, back in the Middle Ages, claimed to have found the Ark of the Covenant. I'd be fascinated to know what this temple is that they found there. It could have been something where the Ark of the Covenant was kept at one point. Anyway, the Templars claimed to have found this big golden chest, the Ark of the Covenant. They brought it back to England. They even built a chapel to keep it in so that they could go there and worship it or whatever they did. And then their Templars were overthrown in 1307, but some of them survived in Britain. And because the king here didn't like the Pope, so because the Pope had excommunicated them and ordered them to be burned at the stake, the king in England said, no, I'm not doing that. They can stay here if they want. The last of them were at the place near Stratford-upon-Avon, actually, in the centre of England, where Shakespeare comes from. And what they did was, when the Black Death came in the middle of the 1300s, they hid this ark and they left a whole series of clues painted on the walls of this chapel as to where it was. And in my book, I actually try and solve these clues, try and follow these series of historical, ancient ciphers on the walls, and look for the Ark of the Covenant. I haven't found it yet, but that's what I'm doing.
So in the Ark of the Covenant, is that where the tablets where the Ten Commandments are written? Is that where they were stored?
Absolutely. It was a big golden chest with a couple of golden angels on the top.
So these tablets, from what you've researched, who wrote those tablets? Was that God?
According to the Bible, it was God. It could have been Moses chipping them away when he was channeling God. Who knows? I mean, we've only got Moses' word when he comes down from the top of the mountain.
That's an interesting mystery, right? And then we also, I know this is you probably haven't researched it yet, but they have that the visual of something in the side of Mount Ararat, who they think could be like something like Noah's Ark. That's
Noah's Ark. I haven't done anything. I haven't found that. I haven't investigated Noah's Ark.
You need to fly. You need to get up there. It's really hard to get to, I heard.
I don't climb mountains. I'm too old for that one. But I did find what happened is when I followed the clues of the Knights Templars to the area where there was where they might have hidden the Ark, we found out that the area had been disturbed and whoever the Ark might have moved somewhere else. But we did find a tablet which was inscribed with an early form of Hebrew text called Proto-Sinaitic script, which dates from the period that Moses came from. And it's been examined by museums, and they have said that it's made from the kind of sandstone that is at a mountain at Petra, above where the Templars claim to have found the Ark. So it is possible, just possible, that this stone that we found, this stone tablet, is one of the Ten Commandments, or at least one of the Ten Commandments stones. So I don't know. It's being examined at the moment by the Brigham Young University in Salt Lake City. So we'll see what they do.
So, but the Egyptians didn't have these Ten Commandments. They must have had some other type of. They had their own worship there during that time period, right?
Yeah, the Egyptians, if they'd have created, would have been written in hieroglyphics. But this is written in early Hebrew script. This is something which was specifically Israelite and not Egyptian.
So after the fall of Egypt, at that point, then God decided to tell everybody through Moses what the commandments were and how we needed to live.
The Bible tells us that we go up, Moses goes up to the mountain on his own. There's a cloud comes over it. He comes back down with these tablets. First time he gets annoyed because he sees them worshipping a golden calf, and he drops them. He has to go back and get them again because he's broken them. And he comes back down. He's the only one who actually goes up there. One of the Ten Commandments actually tells us that thou shalt not kill. And the first